Prepositions in relative sentences for C2 students. You probably remember this TV series. Well, in the ninth episode of its second season, there was an exchange between Leonard and Sheldon that went something like this. Leonard said, "And you want to know the worst part? You don't understand what you did wrong because you can't conceive of something that you're not an expert in." To which Sheldon, who's a stickler for good grammar in the series, replied this, "In which I'm not an expert." Now, that is the kind of stuff that I find particularly irksome because it reinforces an utterly ludicrous notion, namely, that we are not supposed to finish sentences with prepositions, as we see here. They are called dangling prepositions, and some speakers who are overly picky with grammar have decided that they should be avoided at all costs. Well, there is nothing wrong with them, but they put them in the same list. They put the wrong use of apostrophes. As a matter of fact, someone created the Apostrophe Protection Society. I believe that in order to preclude atrocities like this from happening, granted, it is true that it's painful to look at, but they think it's as offensive as the double negative. By the way, I want to believe that you understand the musical reference right there. Anyway, for a cool teacher, I think dangling prepositions are something they should have absolutely no problem with. And yes, I say no problem with deliberately, of course. And yet, for some unfathomable reason, the stereotype persists. And in movies and in TV series, time and again, we find that character that is a bit of a stickler or a snob and correct people's grammar. In the 80s, it was Diane Chambers in Cheers. In the 90s, it was Fraser Crane. And then in the 2000s, Sheldon Cooper came along. In olden times, it used to be some sort of James Bond supervillain that would be cold, cultured, witty, generally annoying because they need to be hateable characters. So let's travel back in time and visit Mr. Winston Churchill. Now, not many people seem to remember now that he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. I don't know if he actually deserved such a great honor, but that is immaterial. For the purpose of this presentation, we're going to center on a precious anecdote that involves some editor that was proofreading, I suppose, a manuscript by Churchill. Now, he had noticed a dangling preposition and rearranged the text to avoid that preposition at the end. Winston Churchill noticed the correction and scribbled a little note for the editor. Now, that memorable note read like this: "This is the sort of bloody nonsense up with which I will not put." Now, up with which is so ridiculous. It was just priceless. It was masterful, all right? So let's travel back to the present. What happens now? Well, now if you're a pedant that corrects people's grammar in public, that you're a grammar Nazi, you belong to the grammar police, or you can be a snob, or a peever, or a traditionalist, or a nitpicker, or a purist, a stickler, a pedant. The fact that there are so many different labels to designate this sort of person, this social type, speaks volumes about people's attitude towards these individuals. So you may be wondering, what do I think? Well, I agree with Mr. Churchill. Those pedants usually are non-linguists, and they think this is right or wrong. Things are correct or incorrect, when the fact is that in cases like the dangling prepositions, for instance, we should consider the notion of register. There is a loftier register, higher register, and a standard register. Those two sentences you see right there mean exactly the same thing. So this one is okay, and the other one is okay. It's just a matter of style or context. Let's analyze this. He tendered his resignation in a letter addressed to the president. In it, he outlined the framework, blah, blah, blah. Now, it feels like the context is rather formal, but look at that. In it letter, we use two words to refer to the same thing in two different sentences. That is lazy writing, not really advanced material. He tendered his resignation in a letter addressed to the president, in which he outlined the framework. That's a completely different story. This flows a lot better. At any rate, they both belong to the intermediate level. So what is truly advanced? Well, listen to this. He tendered his resignation in a letter in accordance with which. That kind of sequence, that prepositional phrase is advanced. Look at that. 3 words before the relative pronoun. That is not something you find in the intermediate level. Do we need to talk like that all the time? Of course not. But in this particular case, listen to that. Whether it is feasible to steep oneself in, to internalize and echo the agony of Lear so as to strengthen, to render more concrete our moral and civic resources, is a question to which I have no answer. That was written by none other than Harold Bloom, the celebrated literary critic. Now, just look at that. I mean, it's so cognitively demanding. The sophistication is justified. In this other case, we find in addition to which. If you pay attention to the text, it feels like it might be some instructions manual or something, but it's formal, technical, who knows, maybe scientific, in addition to which is, again, very well justified. I ran 10 miles without stopping, at which point I felt sick. This is a different sort of construction, which does not refer to anything here, which is a determiner. If we imagine that this woman is running and she finds herself at this point, she has been maybe at this point, this other point before. So the question, at which point did she do that? It's like, which of these colors do you like? You refer to one point in particular. That is not a relative sentence. Anyway, at which point is advanced. Wherein, whereby, all these funny, fancy words starting with where, they have more accessible versions. Here we see wherein names connect to other names, dates, and it means in which, okay? But look at the text. They're talking about employing the semiotics of conspiracy research. Maybe the formal register makes sense. Whereby you could have certain portions is in accordance with which. Both terms are rather sophisticated. Whereby in the dictionary is described as by, through, or in accordance with which. Where do we find those texts? Well, mostly they belong in a long list of fossilized terms, and they are perfectly okay. Where do we find those words? Whereupon, whereafter, wherefore, whereunder. They have understandable meanings, and you might wonder, why should I use wherefore, which means for which reason, which in reality is a glorified form of why? Well, they belong to a particular sort of jargon used by judges and lawyers, and very often called legalese. This is what you find in a contract, in some obscure clause. Think of it as something that you're not supposed to use, but you're expected to understand. Let's now compare these two sentences. We are dealing with a pandemic we have never seen in this century. There's something missing that might make those two chunks gel together, and that is the likes of which. Now listen to this. We are dealing with a pandemic, the likes of which we have never seen in this century. Now that is emphatic, that is advanced. And by contrast, we see that we are dealing with a pandemic we have never seen in this century. What is missing there is just anything like it. Now, I would say that that is lazy writing. We use pandemic and it, two lexical items that refer to the same thing. Lazy writing, not a good idea. 1 and 2 sentences, that's a no. But we are dealing with a pandemic, the likes of which we have never seen in this century. I kind of like that. So, In conclusion, dangling prepositions, that is some kind of nonsense that it's difficult to put up with. You can say that, or you can dispense with the prepositions and use the verb to tolerate, but that doesn't really make you advanced. It's the stuff like to whom, wherein, or in response to which that sounds really C1, C2, and will help you feel cool about yourself. So now you know what to do. As usual, the choice is yours.